Thanks for joining us. And today we're going to talk about the 3 enemies of spiritual development. So the 3 enemies of spiritual development are repression, dissociation, and mythologizing. So the first enemy of spiritual development, repression. So this is something that I've talked about in various videos before. It's basically repressing one's feelings. And there are many spiritual paths where that is very much part of the spiritual activities, is repressing things. It can be conceptualized in terms of character building. So for instance, if you feel a negative emotion, you're trying to replace it with a positive emotion, trying to repress the feelings that you have inside to push them down and to put something in its place. But we know that this doesn't work. A classic example is somebody who's normally considered very spiritually developed and maybe a very intense meditator and so on, and they have they get to these states where they get the expanded states of consciousness, and then they get triggered by something, and then they lose their high state of awareness, and so they kind of yo-yo back between sort of being in this state of expanded awareness and then kind of hitting rock bottom, back and forth. And it's because they have repressed a lot of things that they have not dealt with, and those things have not been processed. And as I said in other videos, your state of consciousness is entirely dependent on your state of inner transformation. And so if you still have issues that you haven't dealt with, your state of consciousness is going to shift accordingly. So if you're in a spiritual practice where you're repressing your feelings, basically you're pushing stuff down that is not going to go away until you deal with it. That's why at Modern Kriya we use particular techniques that leverage both Kriya Yoga and Taoist internal alchemy to process those feelings inside. Things that go back through our history in this present incarnation, if you will, and as well processing patterns that are connected to our ancestry. So if you're in a spiritual path or do particular techniques that repress your feelings, it's only a matter of time before you have to deal with them. And it would be better to deal with them in a harmonious way rather than in a chaotic way. So at Modern Kriya, we provide tools, techniques, and approaches for doing precisely that. So the second enemy of spiritual development, dissociation, is something that is very, very common, and people don't even really realize it's happening. If you are doing some kind of pranayama techniques, and especially if you're going, moving the prana up and down your spine, and then are leaving the prana in your upper center, so either at the medulla or the crown, or the point between the eyebrows, the Ajna chakra, etc., you will get into this sort of dissociated states where you no longer feel like you're connected to your body. It can feel sort of like being in a bit of a dream state. You're kind of out of it, right? And that state of dissociation is something that often trauma survivors will experience, because a way for them to deal with feeling the very challenging situations they're feeling during the trauma is to dissociate, is to, in the awareness in a way kind of leaves the body or floats above the body. And this is not good. What it basically means, it's not really repression, but it's like a split. It's a split from reality, and you don't want that. And in a lot of spiritual paths, people believe that they're above, the lower self, if you will, the ego, these feelings that they haven't been able to process, and hence they kind of split away or float above it. And the idea is that they can float, get so much energy in this dissociated state that they deny that that the body is part of them, right? And being dissociated in that way, it it disconnects you from what's going around. You have energies that are below your kind of dissociated state that haven't been processed, and they need help, right? You need to get in there and help and resolve things. And if you don't do that, if you get dissociated and just sort of float above or be split off from the body, you are not developing at all. You might believe you are, but really you're not. So dissociation is bad. And that, there are, I've seen a fair number of spiritual teachers that get into this dissociated states, and then they advise others who are more body-centered on things that they should be doing. And what they're doing is they're taking on a spiritual facade, right? The idea, because they're dissociated from their inner issues, right, the lower self issues, that somehow they have wisdom and perspective on somebody else's situation, and they don't, right? It really needs to be specific. Like if you, for instance, were a carpenter, and you had learned over many years to build the perfect table, and then somebody comes to you who's an apprentice and says, I would like to build a table, and you've had that experience, right? You would say, oh great, okay, I'll show you how to build a table, right? And you can actually advise that person because you've actually gone through the process of learning, right, of developing the skills and actually carrying out the techniques and everything to build that table. So you have the wisdom to share. But if you just have read through books about how to build a table, and then you're just like, oh yeah, it's easy, and then you just sort of take on this facade as if you know what you're talking about and direct them to do it, but you actually haven't done it yourself, you're not coming from a place of wisdom. You're coming from a place of a facade. You have a facade about your knowledge, and you do not want that. You actually and it's a real danger for spiritual teachers that get into this dissociated state, believing they have transcended the challenging feelings and things that they need to work out internally, and they get into this dissociated state and they believe that they've reached a sort of a stage of enlightenment, but actually they haven't. They've just gotten dissociated with the idea that this is part of enlightenment, and it isn't. So if they advise somebody who's just dealing with the challenges, like, oh yeah, why am I getting angry and and I find it's really hard for me to deal with feelings in life, blah blah blah, and then this teacher who's dissociated said, you need to rise above them and get into this state where it doesn't really matter. That person is advising the student in a wrong way. They're not coming up from a place of wisdom. So real danger there. The spiritual facade is something that is quite a danger, both to your own development as somebody on the spiritual path, and to others too. You don't want to get into that. You really need to go through the inner transformation yourself. And as I've said in other videos, your inner transformation is yours, right? So you have unique situations that you need to deal with, right? And that's why Taoist internal alchemy and the modern Korea approach is so dynamic, because it allows you to address what you need to. It's custom ordered. You can apply the techniques custom to what you need and get your inner transformation. It's not about transcending your problems and getting into this evolved state where you can leave everything behind. It's actually dealing with stuff on the ground level, if you will, the basement, and all above. So you're building a strong foundation in your spiritual life, all the way from the foundation up to the top of the roof, right? So that's what we do at Modern Korea. We do not advise people to do this spiritual bypass where they're getting into this dissociated state, all their energy is flowing up to their other upper centers, and they have all this stuff in the middle that hasn't been processed at all. It's a real danger. It's a real stumbling block. And like the proof is in the pudding. I've seen so many spiritual teachers that they're like supposedly up there, but then they're like real not the nice people. You can tell that they're unbalanced, right? But it's because they've got this sort of dissociation, right? Believing that they've transcended, but they haven't. So dissociation, another enemy of spiritual development. So the third one, which I've been thinking about especially recently, is mythologizing. Now, mythologizing is basically like the tall tales of the spiritual life, if you will. And not to bash anyone's religion, but there are tall tales about religious founders, right? And maybe some of them are true, maybe some of them aren't, but there's no way to validate them unless you've had that experience yourself, right? So, but it's not so much stories that are perpetuated by the founders, but often by the followers of the founders. So a classic example in Kriya Yoga is all the mythologized stories about Lahiri Mahashai. I think his family has come out at some points and say, like, most of these are completely untrue, right? You know, the things, you know, if you're an SRF or other devotee, you may have heard stories about, you know, Lahiri going and meeting Babaji, and then his sister Mataji, and, you know, them flying through the air, you know, and then descending into this, like, you know, coming out of the earth, and like there's all this kind of fantastical stories about it, right? And then there are other Kriya Yoga teachers who have, you know, are relatively recent, are, you know, claiming to have met Babaji, right, the sort of mythical founder of Kriya Yoga, etc., etc. And they made a big deal about it, and they used that to help legitimize their own teaching, right? So to say that I have met Babaji personally, and Babaji told me to do this and this and this. And so we see it's not just one person doing it. There are many, many teachers out there who have used sort of the Babaji as like to legitimize the teaching that they're doing, right? So, you know, they might have learned some stuff that flowed from Lahiri's lineage originally, and then it branched off and different teachers taught it. But when you start to use Babaji as a claim for your authenticity, like you're mythologizing your origins, right? So that's a stumbling block. It's a red flag for me, absolutely, for sure, when somebody says, you know, and it might not even be in a Kriya Yoga, they could be something else. And I've seen it like so many times. It's so common. Oh yes, you know, Babaji told me to do this and Babaji told me to do that. Well, maybe Babaji did, but I think probably Babaji didn't. And so, you know, even if Babaji did, would you talk about it, right? So supposedly this high, you know, mythical being, right? This great, you know, ascended master coming down to you, Joe Blow, and telling you to do this stuff. Well, would you say that Babaji made me say that, right? Like, I don't know. If it was me and that happened to me, I would keep it quiet and just teach the stuff and not worry about mythologizing the ancestry of it, you know, and trying to legitimize what I'm teaching, right? Because if it actually works, you don't need to use a mythology to explain it, right? To say, you know, well, don't trust me, trust Babaji, and Babaji said this, so do what I say, right? Or how about if it actually works, why don't you just share the information and see if it will work for other people, right? So that's just the practical, you know, perspective on things. And that's why I've become wary of a lot of spiritual paths, is that they have this kind of mythologizing of their path. And it's okay to have, you know, a cosmology, and it's basically an explanatory model for how your technique or your path works. That's totally fine. But once you start adding mythical beings who are coming down and then giving you all this stuff, it turns into a bit of a tall tale situation. So definitely a red flag if you're seeing this sort of mythologizing in your spiritual path about stuff. I would like just, you know, go, well, hold on, right? So anyway, you know, and I'm not trying to knock anyone's path, but I'm just saying, you out there as somebody who's trying to make some kind of discernment between what's going to work and what's helpful for you in your own spiritual development, if it means drinking the Kool-Aid basically and saying, oh yes, now I must believe in the mythical origins of this particular path in order to be part of it, then it's a total red flag. Okay, so just watch out for that. So yeah, those three basic you know, enemies of spiritual development, they will really set you back, right? Because then you just basically end up drinking the Kool-Aid and not necessarily doing techniques that work, but just doing what other people have told you to do. And then as a group, you say, oh yes, and Babaji told us to do this, or whatever it is, right? You know, you can't question anything. Your process is not open to, you know, for discussion. You're told to keep to yourself, right? Not to share your experiences. Does this sound like isolation and cult mentality to you? Well, it does to me, right? And so, but I understand at the same time, there are some traditions that are very, like, they don't want to share their tradition with people outside. And I think that's totally valid, right? So like the Panchanan Bhattacharya lineage of Lahiri Mahashai's Kriya Yoga, like, so it's a transmission between teacher and student, but in a very, you know, traditional way, right? They don't go out there and, like, you know, give workshops and stuff like that, right? So I can understand that, but once you start to legitimize with these mythical origins, like, and then selling it to other people in that way, like, you know, it's not good. It's a total red flag. So if you have any questions about this video, feel free to send me an email at info@modernkriya.com. Also check our website at modernkriya.com and our YouTube channel. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.